In early 19th century Ireland, land meant survival. The majority of the population were tenant farmers, forced by an unbalanced land ownership system to extract enough food to feed their families from increasingly shrinking plots of rocky, nutrient-poor earth. To survive on so little acreage, these farmers needed a miracle crop. They found it in a specific variety of potato called the Irish lumper. The lumper was uniquely adapted to cold, wet climates and could grow aggressively in soil that would choke out wheat or barley. Look at the lower half of this 19th century botanical illustration. You can see the heavy, packed cluster of tubers crowding the root system. A single acre planted with this specific variant could yield enough calorie-dense potatoes to sustain a family of 6 for an entire year. With starvation kept at bay by this high-yield crop, the demographic math shifted. Between 1780 and 1845, the Irish population exploded, doubling to over 8 million people. Millions of those citizens relied entirely on tiny patches of land. The lumper perfectly solved the immediate crisis of land scarcity, but by funneling millions of people into reliance on a single food source, it built a society teetering on a knife's edge of absolute dependency. The danger lay in how the crop was grown. Potatoes aren't typically grown from seeds. Farmers use vegetative reproduction, cutting up a sprouted potato and planting the pieces directly into the soil to grow new plants. Because of this planting method, there was no genetic mixing. Nearly every single lumper planted across the entire island of Ireland was an exact genetic clone of its parent. Biologists call this a monoculture. In a diverse crop, some plants might have natural variations that allow them to fight off a pest or a disease. In a monoculture, there are no variations. The population has a singular immune profile. In the late summer of 1845, the weather shifted. A prolonged spell of unusually cool, damp, and stagnant air settled over the Irish countryside, blanketing the fields in weeks of heavy moisture. An entire nation was now balancing its survival on a genetically cloned, biologically defenseless crop, trapped in an incubator of perfect humidity. Then the blight came. Carried on the wind from North America and mainland Europe, a microscopic biological threat arrived in Ireland entirely undetected. The invader was Phytophthora infestans, a highly aggressive water mold. It thrives in exactly the cool, wet conditions that had just enveloped Ireland. Look at Figure 1 in this historical study of the fungus. When a spore lands on a damp leaf, it rapidly begins to kill the host tissue, causing these red and brown necrotic patches to spread across the once healthy green surface. Moving to Figures 2 and 3, you see the cellular mechanics. The pathogen extends microscopic thread-like structures called hyphae. They actively pry open the plant's stomata, its breathing pores, and drill down into the cellular structure, literally draining the nutrients out of the leaf from the inside. Down in the bottom sequence, we see how it multiplies. The fungus produces zoogonidia, spores with tiny tails that allow them to actually swim through the microscopic droplets of water on damp leaves, escaping to infect surrounding plants. Down at the microbiological level, Phytophthora infestans was perfectly engineered to weaponize the Irish weather, bypassing the plant's defenses before the farmers even noticed a problem. Once established, those swimming spores washed down into the soil to infect the tubers and blew across the fields to land on neighboring farms. Here is where the monoculture proved fatal. Because every single lumper was a genetic copy, the mold didn't need to mutate or adapt. A spore that could break the cellular walls of a plant in Dublin could instantly dissolve a plant in Galway. The math of the infection was merciless. What began as isolated nodes of rot on the eastern coast compounded geometrically. Within weeks, the map of Ireland was entirely overwhelmed by the mold. For the farmers walking their fields, the reality was visceral. Lush, towering plants collapsed into a putrid black sludge in days. The perfect biological synergy between an aggressive water mold and exact genetic clones turned a bad seasonal harvest into a terminal collapse of the national food supply. When the time came to harvest the crop, the farmers dug into the dirt and found only black slime. Because the lumper was the sole source of sustenance for the peasantry, there were no grain reserves or backup crops to fall back on. As the damp autumn gave way to the freezing winter of 1845, the true scale of the failure materialized. The meager stores of healthy potatoes ran out, and mass starvation gripped the countryside. The physical toll on the agrarian class is documented in this contemporary engraving of Bridget O'Donnell and her children. The rapid loss of caloric intake hollowed out communities, leaving millions physically exhausted and skeletal. Starvation was quickly followed by opportunistic diseases like typhus and cholera, which tore through the weakened population. Those who could gather the funds chose the only remaining option: boarding overcrowded ships in a desperate, massive wave of emigration. The biological death of the potato fields resulted in a permanent demographic rupture. 1 million people died, 2 million more fled. The population of Ireland was slashed by a quarter, accelerating a massive global diaspora. The collapse of the Irish fields resulted from a specific biological accident meeting a rigid agricultural structure that left no margin for error. The agricultural system prioritized absolute efficiency, extracting the maximum possible calories from the smallest possible land. But it traded long-term survival for that short-term efficiency, hiding a catastrophic fragility beneath the soil. This historical event remains a foundational lesson for modern agricultural science. It demonstrates how eliminating variety in favor of yield transforms a localized infection into a total systemic collapse. When a system is designed for absolute efficiency at the expense of resilience, it creates a hidden debt. A system without biological variety ensures that it only takes one microscopic vulnerability to bring the entire structure crashing down. Survival across the vast expanse of the Russian interior has always been dictated by the brutal realities of extreme cold. 6 months of the year bring freezing temperatures and heavy snowpack that lock the earth down entirely. That climate poses a lethal threat to traditional above-ground grains like rye. Because the bulk of the plant grows exposed to the air, a single unexpected early frost can kill the stalk before the grain ever matures. When that happens, the entire harvest is lost in a matter of hours. For centuries, one erratic drop in temperature reliably triggered widespread, devastating famine across the country. To maintain control and secure its labor force, the imperial state needed a reliable way to keep its population fed regardless of the weather. They required a high-calorie food source that could survive the freezing surface temperatures. State agriculturalists eventually found a crop that perfectly solved this exact biological vulnerability. Yet, when they tried to distribute it, the very peasants starving in the fields aggressively rejected the intervention. The state found that protecting the food supply meant breaking through deep-rooted peasant traditions that viewed any outside intervention as an attack on their way of life. The potato's steady migration from Western Europe pushed across harsh borders and deep into the Russian interior, promoted by the state as a vital tool for survival in the north. The potato relies on subterranean caloric insulation. Tubers form below the frost line, disconnected from the freezing air above. When surface frost destroys the green stalks, the dirt acts as a thermal blanket, keeping the buried crop intact. While a severe cold snap would decimate a field of rye, a potato crop yields hundreds of pounds of harvestable calories per acre under the exact same weather conditions. The potato functioned as an organic, weather-resistant battery. It bypassed the surface-level freezing that historically decimated Russian agriculture. The government shifted from making recommendations to issuing formal decrees. Central authorities demanded widespread potato planting across rural provinces. Provincial governors and local bureaucrats were placed under immense pressure. Those who failed to enforce the new planting quotas faced harsh systemic penalties from the capital. But on the ground, the peasantry viewed this strange route with intense skepticism, deeply distrusting distant officials forcing them to alter ancestral methods. Cultural and religious rumors took hold. Communities began referring to the crop as the devil's apple, convinced that the foreign vegetable was either biologically poisonous or spiritually corrupting. The resistance escalated into the potato riots. Starving populations burned the very crops engineered to preserve their lives, choosing the familiar threat of famine over the perceived unholy imposition of the state. A government can possess a perfect, life-saving biological tool, But forcing it onto a population fails when the people view the solution itself as a threat to their identity. The stalemate eventually broke under the weight of sheer biological necessity. A series of consecutive, devastating winters wiped out the grain reserves, leaving the rural population with a choice: eat the mandated potato or starve. Hunger overrode superstition. The practical need to survive the winter forced villages to quietly integrate the newly harvested tubers into their daily meals. As cultivation stabilized, the root rapidly became the bedrock of the rural diet. The reliable underground yields effectively severed the link between sudden cold snaps and total agricultural collapse. By successfully institutionalizing the potato, the state proved its capacity to permanently restructure the nation's food supply, moving from paper decrees to organized harvesting lines. Securing a country's long-term survival against a hostile geography required the political will to break through the population's deep fear of the unknown.